And we should be live.
Okay, terrific. Wonderful. So glad that we've got a terrific event for us today. My name is Robert Baines. I am president of the NATO Association of Canada, and we're thrilled to be putting on this event to explore some of the global implications of the COVID-19 crisis and specifically some of its implications for the rules-based international order. We've got a wonderful panel for us today, but before we delve into that, I just wanted to give a bit of a sense about what the NATO Association of Canada is and what we're trying to do. We are a charitable nonprofit whose goal is to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security and the importance of NATO. NATO is not an organization that most Canadians think of on a day-to-day basis. I think that's safe to say. But it is an organization, and security itself is a principle and a condition that most Canadians should not take for granted. Our job at the NATO Association is to try to make sure we put on events, engage through social media, and publish articles so that Canadians constantly consider the value of security, the importance of NATO, and just what an amazing thing the rules-based international order is and how important it is to Canada. So with that, we're going to have a ranging discussion today. First of all, I'm going to ask Milena Glumak, one of our program editors at the NATO Association, to introduce our three speakers. Then I'm going to be taking our three speakers through some prepared questions, which I will moderate. At that point, Milena will then turn to some of our questions from YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, if you can please put some questions into the right sidebar there, and Milena will be able to ask them at the second half of this discussion. And then finally, we will be hearing some final thoughts from all of our panelists. But with that, Milena, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is my honor to introduce the three speakers we have today. The first being the Honorable David Collenette, who served as Member of Parliament for 21 years and as a Minister for 11 years. He held several portfolios, including multiculturalism, national defense, Veterans Affairs, Crown Corporations, Minister for the GTA, and Minister for Transport. David was also involved in the first ever NATO air campaign, Operation Deliberate Force. He was also a strong advocate for the North Atlantic Council for the NATO enlargement through the Partnership for Peace program. Since his retirement, he has been active on not-for-profit boards of directors and has served on many democratic development missions around the world for the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Julie Dzerowicz. She is the first female member of Parliament for Davenport. During her time as a member for the National Defense Committee, Julie visited the Canadian Armed Forces stationed in Senegal and Mali as part of a United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, the United Nations peacekeeping mission. Julie was also joined HMCS Charlton in the summer of 2018 for Operation Nanook, traveling from St. John's to Iqaluit to ensure a more persistent presence in the north and to enhance surveillance and control of the Arctic region. Thank you for joining us, Julie. I would now like to introduce David Fraser. He is a retired Major General and a decorated Canadian military officer and the country's first general to command American troops in combat since World War II. His most noteworthy role was as a brigadier general in the Battle of Operation Medusa, which took place in Afghanistan as part of NATO's coalition efforts in the region. Since retiring from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2011, after 32 years of service, Fraser has worked in the private sector, currently serving as a president for Aegis 6 Corporation. Thank you all for joining us. And now I'd like to hand it over to Robert.
Thanks so much, Milena. Okay, well, now that we've got to know our speakers a little bit more, I'm really happy that we're going to dive into a few interesting questions. The COVID situation has been touching just about every aspect of our country and international relations. NATO has had to deal with it significantly, the UN obviously, the WHO. There are many different knock-on effects that these impacts are having on the rules-based order itself. Just how people are trusting it, what they're thinking about it, what its future may be. So I'm just going to start off with an introductory question to all three of our panelists, and I'm hoping that they'll each take 5 minutes to answer this very open-ended first question. And that's specifically that many writers are taking a look at the new normal post-COVID-19. In what ways might this new normal reverse some of the pre-COVID trends, challenging the rules-based international order? And in what ways may things stay the same? And then, of course, most importantly, what way may previous trends be accelerated? So first of all, I'd like to start off with David Collenette. David, what are your first thoughts?
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and welcome everyone. And it's an honor to be with the two panelists, one a member of Parliament from my home city of Toronto, and the other a very distinguished veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces who made an incredible contribution to this country in Afghanistan and throughout his career. There's little consensus what a new normal will be like post-COVID. But there's no doubt the pandemic will have far-reaching implications for global society, way more than 9/11 that I was involved with when I went into transport as Minister of Transport on that day. The enemy at that time was a state-sponsored terrorist group motivated by many grievances, historic, territorial, ethnocultural, religious. Today, the enemy is invisible, hard to detect, and one that respects no boundaries, no social order, no political ideology or religion. Radical measures to combat the virus are slowing down the world economy, as we all know. We're living through it, and in a way, it's slowing down the whirlwind of the last 30 years, which I think is going to have a seminal effect on a number of things: personal values, familiar relationships, the lifestyle, the role of government, income distribution, and the environment. And in some ways, that may be positive. But on the downside, I'm worried. I'm worried that the new normal post-COVID environment will see an acceleration of tensions that could undermine world security and the international order that was crafted post-Second World War. And this was already underway before the pandemic from populist forces, including those of our NATO allies. In a worst case scenario where no vaccine is developed and an economic depression comes about, this will fragment the world economy, and it will accelerate uncontrolled migration and fuel more strident nationalism around the world. And as nations look inwards and borders close, domestic inequality could bring pressure on governments to divert attention and allow them to prompt attacks on neighboring states for a number of reasons. Faith in the international rules-based order and expert opinion will erode. And as we've seen, it's been eroding in the last few months with attacks on the World Health Organization, medical experts, scientists. And, you know, those of my age and older whose parents and grandparents lived through the early part of the 20th century, the Depression, the Second World War, the Cold War, have seen this movie before, to use that kind of expression. And let's hope that history doesn't repeat it, but the worrying signs are there. Now, my view is that, you know, NATO and of course NORAD has provided a security blanket not only for Europe, North America, but for the world for 70 years. And it's fostered geopolitical stability and an extraordinary economic growth. And I believe that the core mission of NATO is still valid today. You know, we have a revanchist Russia that's made excursion to the Crimea, and God knows where else they would go if NATO hadn't been exercising its forces in Europe. And that, I think, reiterates the need for a collective defense, a continuation of collective defense. But NATO has a whole host of other challenges that it's been facing, including terrorism, border security, cyber attacks, and you know, Brexit. That's been a challenge for NATO. The push for an EU military strategy, climate change, and of course the rising global reach of China. And that was all before COVID-19. You know, the main adversary of the 20th century that we had to deal with, the Soviet Union, was a nuclear threat, but it wasn't an economic one. And despite the rhetoric and threats, NATO served as a check and actually facilitated cooperation between East and West on many fronts, including nuclear weapons limitation. And along the way, NATO became more global in reach, first with the intervention in former Yugoslavia, something that I was familiar with in the 3 years that I was at Defense, but even more so post 9/11 in Afghanistan, where General Fraser was a distinguished soldier, Libya, and Iraq. And all these actions were sanctioned by the United Nations. In effect, and this might be a controversial statement, the UN, in my view, has set a precedent for recognition of NATO as a de facto global security force. Now, over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of China as an economic powerhouse and a potential security threat, especially in Southeast Asia. China's role as the incubator of CB-19 and the actions it took to manage the virus have added another dimension to relations with the world community. And how this challenge is handled will be crucial, since the economies of China, the United States, and other developed nations, including our own, are integrated in a way that was not the case with the Soviet Union. Now, any rational person would say, look, we should just talk, negotiate, if you will, and have dialogue. But the effects of COVID-19 and a depressed global economy could generate almost insurmountable pressure within China and on the Chinese government to embark on foreign incursions as a diversionary tactic and also for long-term strategic goals in violation of international law. And I'm thinking particularly the Chinese expansion around the Spratly Islands and the risks to the political militarization of the South China Sea, which would threaten neighboring countries' ownership of natural resources and interfere with major shipping lanes that are used by most countries in the world. And as a coincidence, in today's Globe and Mail, there was a report by a speech given by Ambassador Barton, our own ambassador to China, who reflected many of these concerns. Mm-hmm. So assuming a continued support for rules-based international order and institutions, the question then of enforcement cannot be ignored. A Pacific regional security organization modeled on NATO might be an option, but that could only happen with American support. But of course, the US is in turmoil in many respects, and one could not assure that would happen given the isolationist forces that you have within the United States in any way. In any event, whatever the election result, whatever the global security threats, whether in the Atlantic or the Pacific, they must be addressed. And I think that NATO could be part of the response. You know, in life, you don't live on past glories, but you can build on past strengths. And I think a revived or revivified NATO with a global reach may be the only option for world stability. And ironically, an expanded reach for NATO could be the legacy of the fight by all nations against an insidious pandemic. Thank you.
That's terrific, David. Really appreciate that point of view. It's something I often remind people who are in our office that NATO is not necessarily against any one adversary. It could be used against any situation wherein there is a common foe, a common enemy. Could be aliens, could be zombies, could be COVID. The idea is that an attack upon one is an attack upon all, and there's nothing stronger than that. All right, with that, Julie, would you mind giving us some of your first thoughts?
Sure. I just want to start off by saying thanks to Milena for the kind introduction, and thank you, Robert, for moderating the session. And I just want to say to the Honorable Collenette and to Major General, the retired Major General David Fraser, just what an honor to be on a panel with both of you. You both have made enormous contributions to Canada, and you serve as an inspiration and a continued inspiration for people like me and to all Canadians. So in terms of my contribution, you know, I think Canada has moved into a much more in a world that's continued to be more unpredictable and more unstable. And I think this is the new normal. I think that Canada moving forward has to be more alert, more agile, And we have to be aware always about who our friends are and who's willing to work with us to continue to keep the peace and as much as possible stability in the world. In June of 2017, our current Deputy Prime Minister and the then Minister of Foreign Affairs gave a wonderful speech in the House of Commons. And in that speech, she reaffirmed very strongly Canada's deep engagement and commitment to global order based on rules, and our commitment to our multilateral institutions. She said at the very heart, it is consistent with our values, which is territorial integrity, human rights, democracy, respect for the rule of law, and an aspiration for free and friendly trade. And indeed, because Canada's a middle power, where we are situated in the world, we are only able to have the kind of standard of living that we continue to want to live, and to continue to have the type of peace and stability in the world if we continue to have a strong rule-based international order, and if we continue to have these unbelievable, very effective multilateral institutions in the world. So in terms of, so I want people to know that that's a huge commitment from our government. We continue to be very committed to it, and we continue to support it. So there's been a recent meeting of NATO defense ministers in mid-April. There was a continued commitment to NATO at that time. We have reaffirmed our commitment to the World Health Organization and actually put some additional funding into it. We, as you know, are running for a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. And I think the voting that they're trying to figure out how to do that online is happening right now. So again, complete and absolute commitment to these international based rules, as well as multilateral organizations. In terms of trends, in terms of what they're changing and not, I actually think a number of the trends that we saw before the pandemic continues to exist, and if anything, are going to be exacerbated. And I think the Honorable David Collenette has already mentioned some of them. Climate change, that was an issue before, it will only continue to be an issue. Civil war, poverty, national disasters, that will continue. Dictatorship, extremism, Russian aggression, that will continue. And inequality, which is huge, that will continue. What are some of the things in terms of what will change, what will not, and what and by how much, I think has yet to be determined in, and I'll mention some areas. Trade, international trade. So we have a lot of closed borders right now. So what does trade look like afterwards? Absolutely, Canada will continue to engage in trade, but I think we're all relooking, what does that mean moving forward? So I think that's going to be one of the questions. The United States, in my opinion, I think they seem distracted. They're not really paying attention to what's happening abroad. I think they're very much focused on China, but I think it's because it's impacting their internal economy. And I think there's a big focus on the upcoming elections. So I think what's happening there is going to be interesting. China, as was mentioned, and the article about that the Ambassador Dominic Barton made, in terms of negative soft power. And I think, you know, the reputation of China starting to suffer right now as we're seeing some of their actions around the world. I think in terms of how the world deals with China, I think is one of the questions moving forward. International aid. You know, when I visited Senegal and Mali, it was unequivocal to us that you cannot have security without international aid, and you can't have aid without security, and they go hand in hand. The Canadian government made an announcement yesterday to provide significant amount of funding into vaccines, as well as over the last few weeks, we've made a significant investment in terms of trying to help developing countries around fighting COVID-19. And that's in addition to all of our, I think, $6 billion in total spending around international aid, but that will continue. But how will that be impacted as our budgets are decreasing, as we have increasingly unstable economies, and we know that overall budgets are going to be decreasing? Global leadership. I think that we have started seeing before COVID-19 a number of countries trying to be more insular and be less likely to open their borders to migrants. I think the migrant issue is big. I think you have over 4 million in Turkey right now. and what is the instability that's causing that area and in that area. And so what is, how are we going to deal with that? And then Russia. So we know domestically they are being hugely impacted by COVID-19. We know, in my opinion, I think they're trying to deflect any attention to the internal politics. And so they're starting to, people are wondering about how are they going to be reacting internationally. So I know we've heard of Russian maneuvers in the Arctic. And so I'm not sure, are they going to start turning their attentions to the Baltics? Are they going to start turning their attentions to Ukraine? We're not quite sure. So these are some of the trends and some of the things that I think we all have to look out for. And I'm sure that we're going to delve a little bit more into it as we engage in the subsequent questions. So thanks for that.
It is something of a laundry list, isn't it? Is that all we have to deal with? That's terrific. Well, now I'd like to turn to my dear friend, Major General David Fraser. Also, one of the things that Milena's biography missed out is that you were the commander of the largest battle in NATO's history as well. So I always love making sure people know that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Robert, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's great to be with you today and to be with two great parliamentarians. Nothing is more important than service to our nation, and people who serve our nation at the federal, provincial, municipal level, we don't give them enough credit because, I mean, they affect our lives every day. So thank you for your service and what you've done. And thank you for putting on today, because I think, in a word, this is an evolution. It's not a revolution. And the evolution that's happening has been going on for some time. Pandemics happen all the time. COVID happens to be the current pandemic. If we go back to 1919, 1918, the Spanish flu was probably the last major pandemic that killed over 50 million people. But nobody remembers that one, but we are in the midst of this one. And I think if there's a word I want to sort of leave everybody with, would be acceleration. The evolution that we've seen for the last 20 to 30 years is accelerating at a pace that will make us all uncomfortable, will challenge us right to our core. Mm-hmm. And I think what COVID is, there is no going back to how we used to do business. Mm-hmm. How the order will not be the same post-COVID. Our society in Canada will not be the same post-COVID. And our personal lives will not be the same post-COVID. The fact that we're having this conference in Zoom and on YouTube is a testament to the new norm. Mm-hmm. And nobody knows all the new norm is going to be, but it will be an acceleration of things that we have been experiencing. And I think that will challenge Canada in so many different ways. Our stable, slow, methodical, dull approach that has made Canadians so well loved, we now no longer can be slow. We actually are going to accelerate far beyond our comfort zone. And we are going to be driven to make decisions that affect the global and be affected by global actions, to be affected on our society and that affect us personally. And I want to talk about three in particular before we get into some more defense side. The first one is on digitization. We all talked about it. We're living it right today on digitization. And what was not possible 2 months ago is now the norm. We are not traveling around the world to meet face-to-face. We are using technology now. Banking systems, which were paper-based, are now becoming digitized in a way that we never thought of before. And just everything that we do now is going to be driven by digits. And so leadership now is going to be far more difficult because we don't have people that we can see face-to-face and read body language. But through digitization, we're going to have to figure out leadership of not just leading people, but leading machines to do what we want them to do and make those things happen. Simplistically, what does digital leadership mean? It means having to talk to programmers to make sure that they're doing what we want them to do and doing all the beta tests and whatnot. But this whole idea of digitization is going to be the norm in a post-COVID world. And you're seeing all sorts of articles now about the second point I want to talk about, which is the work environment. we're not going back to downtown offices. Downtown and those big high rises, people are now talking about a hybrid workforce that is going to be working at home. And, you know, in one sense, it's harder to work at home when you got cats and kids running around in the background. But the other thing is, you know, there's an awful lot more that we can do, and we don't need to have a 600 square foot condominium downtown for $500,000. We'll buy a $500,000 house at 2,000 square feet to go out in the burbs. But if you own buildings downtown, it's not a good thing. So that work environment is going to be driven and changed because of the COVID situation, which kind of drives the last point I want to talk about, and it's just the economy itself. Some of the reports out there are stating that 30% of businesses will not reopen ever again. There are going to be losers in this economy. And the economy that has taken 40 years to go from regional, and if you want to look at the last time we had regional economies was probably around pre-1900, 1919, and we became a global economy, just-in-time delivery. That economy construct ain't going to be here in 5 years. It already started to change in the last 5 to 7 years. So the global economy is going back to be very much a regional economy, and our supply chains, which were dependent on international markets coming out of China, are going to be coming back. And we're seeing already a transfer of jobs and the supply chains back into Canada, back into the United States. It was being driven by Trump. But that is going to accelerate far more so than we've ever seen before, which will change the very fundamental natures of how does the global situation look like, how do our countries work, and how do we as people work. And that has an impact on the social and the global stability of what's going on around the world, which actually puts a great more emphasis on what do our alliances look like. Our alliances with Europe through NATO. Most importantly, what is our alliance and the relationship happens with the United States of America? The United States of America has been going through a huge transformation, and it's not just Trump. Trump has accelerated beyond anything we've ever seen. But if you look at the isolationist approach that Trump is taking, the failed strategies of the Obama and the Bush vis-a-vis Southwest Asia, the Middle East and whatnot, those strategies and those directions are accelerating, that it's going to impact not just the economy, but the stability of the world. So what's the impact on Canada? What's the impact on NATO? I think these are good questions to have. The short term, not much, because we're not going to be focused on economy and finance and the impact about us and healthcare. The whole ideas are going to shift and the priorities are going to shift, but to the mid to the long term, there are going to be huge impacts because of this acceleration that COVID is doing. And what is that impact fundamentally going to be in 15 or 20 years time? A lot more destabilization around the world, which will affect our security. And I'll talk a little bit later about China and about Russia, but just as an opening sort of throw out, I think digitization, impact on the work environment and on the economy will affect the global Canadian society, and individually, that matrix, there is a new norm, and we're still working out trying to figure out what that's going to be. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. So I'd like now to turn, picking up your last comment about the economy, I'd like to turn to David Collenette and just talk a little bit about that the economy piece and NATO. So we're taking a look at a situation now with COVID, the new normal. We're going to have a lot of money that is currently being spent on the workforce, making sure that the country's economy does not fall apart. That's pretty much the same across the board. Europe, the United States, everybody's dealing with the same pressures. So for Canada, this might turn public opinion against big ticket military investments. Like new fighter jets, for instance, which we've been waiting for quite a while for. Instead, it might turn in favor of overseas development aid if we are going to do investments overseas, funding for the WHO perhaps. But where does that leave Canada's contributions to NATO in the next few years? What do you think, David?
Well, you know, Robert, we were a bit of a schizophrenic nation. And I saw this in government. You have a large body of opinion in the country that believes that we should be internationalists, that we should be pacifists, that we should deal with overseas development aid and not be militaristic. And of course, Lester Pearson, who served in the First World War, came out of that war absolutely hating war and everything associated with it. And, you know, was the person behind the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations. And I found that within my own party, the Liberal Party, an overwhelming number of people, you know, share the Pearsonian view. But there are others, including myself, who are a bit more realistic. And I think that we've had this dichotomy of opinion over the last almost close to 100 years of people who believe in more internationalism and pacifism, and others that believe that we should be on guard, that the world is a dangerous place, and it would be nice not to have an army, a navy, an air force, but there are always threats out there. So when you come then to the whole question of contributions to NATO, as you know, I think it was in 2014, a deal was made before Donald Trump got there for member nations to gradually ramp up their contributions and towards the 2% GDP. And Canada has been doing that along with other countries. And I think that hopefully will continue, but there will be pressures within to say, look, we now have so much debt, we're creating so much debt. I mean, this is unprecedented what financial institutions worldwide have done to, in effect, dig ourselves out of this enforced layover, if you will, or you know, stalling of the economy. And the military investment will sort of get lost in the shuffle. And I saw it at Cabinet where, you know, I guess when we came in, we had the Red Book, and there was supposed to be defense budget cuts. There was a peace dividend from the ending of the Cold War, and that peace dividend meant that money went from the military into social programs and the like. And then we had a debt position problem as well. But then what happened after 9/11, as General Fraser knows, by serving in Afghanistan, the Canadian military had to be refunded in a very rapid manner to allow him and his colleagues to fight for us in a battle that was essential in terms of world security, and as far as I'm concerned. And so you're going to have pressure on the current government to not go forward with the military spending that it's committed to. It decided to ramp up, and, you know, new capital expenditures with the fighter jets, frigates, supply vessels, all of those big ticket items, they will come under scrutiny. And so this is a debate that we're going to have within the country. And I know what side I'm on, and I'll be out there using whatever you know, persuasive powers I can to say to people, look, look back at history. Look what we've gone through since the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and all of the tragedy we've had to deal with, and look at what NATO has done, what a real determination for security has done to create a peaceful environment. So let's not lose sight of that particular benefit of the military alliance, and specifically NATO.
It's going to be some definitely some tough questions. And Julie, you're of course part of the NATO Parliamentary Association, and discussing the value of NATO and of course the security. So you're going to be right in the middle of these discussions on how to deal with these big ticket items that we really do need for defense, but the money is definitely going to be very tight. So be interested to hear your quick comments on that.
Sure, and I should probably also mention that I was also in Brussels at a NATO parliamentary session in February. So, and actually we had Nancy Pelosi there with a full US team come out to reaffirm at that time their huge commitment towards NATO, and then to make sure they came out in full force to show their commitment. But as you know, the world has changed completely since then. But I'm going to agree with David Collenette. I do think that there will be pressure. I sit on finance committee, so that wasn't mentioned in my intro, but I sit on finance committee. Our deficit before the pandemic was at around $24 billion. It's expected to rise to $252 billion by the end of next February. That is assuming that we continue to provide many of the very generous supports that and programs that we've implemented right now. So absolutely, we are. Every country in the world is going to be relooking at their budgets and saying, how is it that we can maximize the dollars that we have, and how is it that we prioritize it? And you could also see in terms of, how does that leave Canada's contributions to NATO in the next few years? You could already see right now that a number of our programs, defense programs, we've slowed them down. We've had to because of COVID-19. People just can't go to work. We can't be building things as fast as we had anticipated. So we know that that's slowing down. We know that if we look at NATO operations in terms of Operation Unifier and Operation Impact, so Unifier is in Ukraine. I know that we have temporarily reduced the number of our personnel that's been deployed there for very valid reasons and in agreement with NATO and with Ukraine. And for Operation Impact, we've also decided to pause our training, operations there in Iraq, again, for many reasons, just in terms of, we have to keep our personnel safe. Iraq is, they have other priorities as well. So a number of operations have actually slowed down. I will say to you that I still believe very firmly that even when all of this shakes out, Canada is going to continue to want to support NATO, will want to continue to support our multilateral organizations. We might ask our organizations to be more efficient, effective, more agile. As our Major General David Fraser had mentioned, we have to be much faster. NATO has to be much faster with communications. We have so many members that require approval. And I think we have some additional challenges. And I just want to touch on something because it hasn't been mentioned. I do think these are two trends that we haven't mentioned. It was mentioned in terms of digitization. Disinformation is a huge issue in our world today, and it'll only continue to be worse, and that's something we're combating. And then cybersecurity is another big issue. And those are two things that we have to be very aware of. And so again, what we were focused in terms of our operations before from a NATO perspective, will they continue to be the same focus? Do we actually recalibrate and actually start looking, well, where is it that we're going to put our focus on? Do we start forming different types of alliances with different multilateral organizations like the UN? So when I was in Northern Africa, so when I was in Mali and Senegal, we were very much working on the US peacekeeping troops, but we learned a lot about the terrorist cells there. And when I was in February at NATO, they were starting to talk about, well, what is their involvement in Northern Africa? And I thought, well, maybe this is something that could be collaborated. So instead of two different groups working, are there different ways that we can actually work with organizations around the world? So I think those are good questions to ask. I think they are productive questions to ask, but I really, truly believe that there will be a continued belief that Canada, as middle power, will continue to want to engage in the world. There's no way we can survive without multilateral organizations. And as David Collenette has mentioned, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And so the reason these multilateral organizations came out is because we didn't want to deal with the carnage and the poverty of what happened before. And so for us to be able to move forward, I know that a big part of the solution will continue to be these multilateral organizations. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Julie. And David, do you mind if I just jump straight into your question as opposed to maybe you can work in a little bit about the big ticket military investments and if COVID will impact those. But I would like to just jump a little bit to the ongoing expansionism of China and Russia and how this has been, really thrown in as compounding the difficulty of the COVID situation. We've also got instability in North Korea, that also posing challenges to stability. But what are you seeing as the main security risk to Canada and NATO if there is a general retrenchment in defense spending when it comes to these adversarial problems?
I think the global stage has been shifting for decades because of ineffective US and international strategies in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. These failed strategies have allowed countries like Iran and Russia to fill the void where the US used to be and where failed activities happened. And if you look at what happened in Libya, you look what's happening in Iraq, you look what's happening in Syria, those are examples where ISIL and Iran and Russia have actually become more of a regional power. And I think that has just been accelerated by essentially what Trump has been doing since he's taken power. But now with COVID, I kind of take exception to say, I don't think as much as Canada wants to be part of international organizations and continue to do what we have traditionally done, the challenge will be is with hundreds of billions of dollars of debt, we're going to be focused on Canada, and we're going to be focused on getting our own economy going and not concerned so much about what's going on in Africa, what's going on in the UN. And look how problematic it was for us to go for 2% GDP. Well, that concern is going to be completely overwhelmed by the economies and about the realities about our supply chains and rebuilding supply chains that are going to support the Canadian economy. And this is not about Canada and the UN or Canada and NATO. It will be about Canada and the United States. FDR brought Canada out of a recession before, and it will be up to Trump, whoever wins in November, that will drive and pull our economy along. And this is going to be the focal point about us. And so Canada and the security in the short term, it's going to be more economic driven than it is going to be security driven. And what I'll say about that is, in the short term, nothing's going to change. We're going to focus on what's going on with NORAD and the Canadian relationship with NATO and NORAD, and how do we contribute to that alliance and about what the US is expecting Canada to do, especially when it comes to the North and the Arctic. Because now we've got Russia and we've got the near North player called China. And regardless about climate control changes, Russia and China now are the big players. And what is Canada going to do about sovereignty to actually support our own sovereignty, but what the United States expects for us to do? I think that's going to be a real challenge to NORAD and a challenge to NATO. And what are we going to do about China and Russia in that regard? I would urge everybody back to read the Jenkins report on defense procurement, because defense procurement, this was done 7 years ago, talked about defense that has a multiplier effect of 1.7 in the domestic economy, 8 times multiplier in the international economy that actually supports economic well-being of our nation. But more importantly, defense procurement is part of a larger Canadian industrial strategy. It didn't have much generation back then because we were globalized. I think COVID is going to drive this acceleration of regional and supply chains, where now we're going to talk about ourselves and how do we get our economy that's tied to the United States, that's tied to an alliance called NORAD, tied to an alliance called NATO, that is all supporting how do we defend our economic globe here that is Canada, United States, and Mexico. So USMCA is going to be even more important to protect ourselves against Russia, against China, which is now the economic threat of the world. They are expanding, and as said to me by the Chinese authorities 2 years ago in Beijing, both our foreign affairs and the PLA, they want to become the next world superpower to take over from the United States. But they want to do it through economic means. They are the Borg right now around the world. They are everywhere, scouring resources to feed their economic horsepower back home, which is just to satisfy a growing middle class, but ultimately to become that world dominating economic superpower to usurp the United States. That is the challenge for the mid and long term, is how are we going to work with China as a world superpower against Russia that is going to be a cyber threat that are going to start playing both economically in our front yard and in our backyard across the Arctic to try to go after resources up there. That concerns me. And how do we work with the United States to reinforce NATO in that construct, NORAD in that construct, with an economic system that is working enough, that keeps our society the way we want it?
General, I'm going to have to, I think I'm going to have to.
That is my concern.
Okay, terrific. Thanks very much. And Julie, just because I do want to get to a few questions that we've got from our viewers. Obviously, there's some concerns that General Fraser and David Collenette have brought up. How do we communicate to Canadians that security is still important, that NATO is still should be of prime international importance as far as Canadians' outlook is concerned? How do we make sure that Canadians understand the value of security and the value of NATO in the current situation? Just like a couple of minutes, then we'll get to some of the other questions.
Sure, it's hard to keep to our 5 minutes and our 1 minute time slots, but it's such an interesting conversation. So I mean, I'll mention a couple of points just because I think it's important for us to get to the Q's and A's. Look, this was a big topic of conversation in February at the NATO Parliamentary Associations. Many of us, we forget, because we've had such long-standing peace in so many of our countries, that we sometimes forget how hard fought our peace has been, and how much all of this, our efforts in terms of the UN, NATO, our defense spending, and how that has actually secured continued peace and stability in our world. And when I say continued peace and stability, largely, it's not everywhere in the world, but it's largely in our world. We've forgotten that. And I think, and it's been to our like, we've been blessed in this country, but I think also we've forgotten that. And so that's why Remembrance Day becomes so important. That's why all of our, Veterans Days, all the days where we are reminding of ourselves about how hard fought this peace is important. So to me, I do think that we have to remind Canadians about why it is that we believe in and adhere to a global order based on rules. And it is because of our standard of living. It is because we need peace, stability in this world if we want to continue to have the kind of lives that we want to lead. So I think that's a key part of it. I truly believe that, and I think that there will be big economic questions. I think change will be happening very quickly. And I do think that a global order based on rules and multilateral organizations will continue to be a core part of how we move forward. What that looks like, I think, is all up in the air. And I agree with General Fraser when he says it's not going to be immediate. You're not going to notice it next year or the year after. It's going to creep up on us. But I do think that is why it's important for Canada to continue to align itself with those who continue to believe in global order based on rules, who continue to believe in multilateral organizations and continue to work with them. Yes, China is a different actor on the global stage right now. Yes, I think the world has to decide how it's going to work with China moving forward, work with the US moving forward. But I think that we're all going to be asking ourselves what that looks like moving forward. I don't think that anything has been predetermined yet. So I'll leave it at that, and we can sort of continue with her questions.
Perfect. Well, then I'll hand it over to Milena, who has a couple of questions prepared. We might have time for a few more. If you've got any question, do put it on the chat at the side of your screen. Go ahead, Milena.
So the first question that I've sort of chosen from the ones that our viewers have proposed is, it can be noted that Ambassador Dominic Barton adopted a considerably more reserved stance on China than usual at a CIC event last week. Is this a harbinger of greater pushback in Canada-China relations?
Well, perhaps I could, I mentioned it earlier, and I was, the timing, because I had written my remarks or my notes yesterday about China, and I wondered if I was perhaps one of the few people concerned. But certainly to hear Ambassador Barton with his experience articulate those concerns, I think everyone should take seriously, and it builds on what General Fraser and Julie have been saying as well. And it's not to play Donald Trump's game of xenophobia and attacking China for the wrong reasons. But I do think that, you know, if you want to be a world player, a big player in the world, there are responsibilities that you have. You have to play by the rules. And I think there's a feeling that somehow China has not been playing by the rules. And I think that those comments by the ambassador really build on a lot of concerns of people to say, look, China, you know, you have to start rethinking, perhaps repositioning yourself within the global community. We all want to get along. We all want to be friends. And as I said earlier, the difficulty here is the interconnection between our economies, which means that, yes, we're going to suffer, and we are suffering right now, but the declining global demand is really going to put pressure on China, as I said earlier.
Mm-hmm. I'll go next if that's okay. So our Prime Minister was asked the question this morning because he, as you all know, he does usually a daily update to the nation around COVID-19. And so his response in terms of what's our position around China, he says, look, Canada's going to continue to focus right now on the health and safety of Canadians and trying to move forward on our economy. That has to be our continued focus. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a number of questions around actions as we come out of this pandemic, not only about China, but a number of other countries around the world. My ad would be, I've had the honor of meeting Ambassador Barton a number of times. And I know that he's actually spent, when he was head of McKinsey, he used to actually live in Hong Kong. And so he knows China very, very well. So I definitely did stand up. I very much appreciated his comments. And I very much appreciated the heads up. And I think it's a heads up to China to say, we want to work with you, but we are starting to be very worried about some actions that are being seen in the world right now. And I do think that, and this is a general comment, there is a, you know, the reputation is suffering a bit. I think a number of countries are starting to ask some questions about their actions, whether it's in Africa, whether it's around some of the, you know, some of their economic actions. I think there are a number of questions for sure.
Can I just ask quickly, do any of you have a hard stop? Julie, do you have to get out of here right away, or?
I do at 4 o'clock. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, well, let's just try another question, and then perhaps the two Davids and I can continue the discussion because there are more questions. But Milena, go ahead.
So the second question is, how concerned are you that post-COVID economic pressure will help a bad state actor like Putin to convince Western leaders to lift sanctions and engage in business as usual?
Anybody?
So how worried are we about post-COVID on, I didn't quite get the last part of your question.
How concerned are you that post-COVID economic pressure will help a bad state actor like Putin to convince Western leaders to lift sanctions and engage in business as usual?
Well, it's not business as usual. The economies are changing forever. And I think, you know, as described before, concerns we had about China are accelerating tremendously. In today's paper, some of the meat plants in the States are owned by Chinese, and where there is a supply shortage of meat in the States, that meat is going to China. So, you know, the impact on China after this is going to be significant, because whether or not you believe how the virus got started or not, I think on the global supply chain, people are starting to ask some very significant questions about China. They don't play the rules. They seem to be only interested in one organization. There's been so many things coming out of this. I think people are going to become very concerned about me, myself, and I, and how is this going to affect our supply chains in China? And there's going to be a strong conversation. And I would say what is lacking in the conversation is global leadership. Global leadership on, and this is where I think NATO can stand up, and where the UN and where our own nation and the United States can stand up to say, globally, we got to come together to talk about how do we make sure there's stability. What do we do about China so we don't get pushed around by an economy that is actually dominating the supply chain around the world and also taking what it wants from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I could just add on the issue of Russia and the sanctions. If a country transgresses international law, as clearly Russia did by moving into Crimea, there have to be consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a consensus to put these sanctions in play. And I don't think that our resolve should be weakened in any way just because of the economic pressures that we're all going to have to deal with. The consequences must be paid by Russia or any other bad actor for something that they have done that transgresses the norms and values of the international community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 100% agree.
And I'll just add one other thing. In a crisis,
mm-hmm.
this is we got to be protect ourselves, because countries like Russia will take advantage of this crisis to do things in this cyber world against us. So we need to protect ourselves against China. We need to protect ourselves against Russia and against China to take care of the interests of Canadians at home and abroad. I think now is not the time to let our guard down, but actually to pay even more vigilant attention to what's going on around the world.
And I just one of the things I started off our whole conversation was, Canada has to be more alert, more agile, and always aware who will continue to work with us around peace and stability in the world. And that's part of the comment. And, to David Collenette's comment, 100%, we absolutely believe we will not stand down on sanctions against Russia. We believe that territorial integrity is critical and has to be respected. And if anything, I think we are on higher alert right now. And I know that's something NATO did talk about in the mid-April meeting with the defense ministers of the NATO nations. They said, if anything, there is a almost heightened alert around, any country who might be trying to take advantage of the current situation in terms of COVID, and a lot of our inward focus as is needed in each of our respective countries to take care of the health and safety of our citizens as well as our economies.
With that, Julie, do you have to make an exit now, you think? Or
I'll take one. I'll stay
one
for
more
one
question,
more, and then
right.
I will rush out. I'm always late for a meeting anyways, as you guys can tell, so.
Okay, so one of our viewers comments, one of the surprising elements of the current crisis is the fact that there has been little international cooperation between countries. How can we convince Canadians and the world more generally that international cooperation is a key element of fighting COVID?
Okay, well, I'll start with that. I was actually looking at this morning because after I read the Dominic Barton article, they're actually, one of the areas where actually the world is actually cooperating quite well with China is actually on scientific research. That's been going long-standing and ongoing, and it's actually been to the benefit of all of us. And I don't know how that will be impacted moving forward. I actually don't agree with the question that there hasn't been international cooperation. I think that there's substantial amounts of international cooperation right now. I think our Prime Minister has come on a number of times to say that he's constantly in touch with other G7 leaders. And he's constantly in touch with not only just G7, I'm sure a number of the G20 leaders as well, in terms of sharing information, in terms of sharing best practices, in terms of talking about some of the things that we might be worried about. There's definitely an unprecedented amount of cooperation between countries in terms of science and knowledge about COVID-19 right now. Dr. Tam, who's our Chief Medical Officer of Health, is usually giddy with when she reports about how much information we're learning, best practices, and that also includes, by the way, all parts of the world, including China, the US, Taiwan, all different parts of the world are really sharing information. We're trying to move as quickly as possible. We have a solidarity trial that's underway in the world today, which is clinical trials that a number of countries have joined to support, and Canada is one of the countries. So what we're doing is a number of our countries, we're testing out different vaccine options to COVID-19, and we are testing one here in Canada at the moment. I believe there's 4 being tested in the world today. It could have increased since the last time I've searched, but I will tell you there is a lot of discussion happening around the world, and the other evidence is just the April 15, defense ministers all gathered, all defense ministers of NATO. Partners have gotten together to talk. So I can assure you there is ongoing and constant communication globally. And I think it's a good thing.
Not only on the health front, Robert, but and Julie is right about the international cooperation, so we shouldn't be too despairing. But on the economic front, the cooperation between central financial agencies, World Bank, the World Banking community has been absolutely phenomenal, and that's heartening to me that there is that degree of cooperation. But there still are the concerns that we've been discussing on the other fronts, whether it's trade and whether it's geopolitical aspirations.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, and I'll just put in a plug for that, just because I'm glad that David Collenette mentioned that, our Minister of Finance is in touch. We're always looking to see in terms of our programs and how we're supporting Canadians, whether we're the best among the best, are we the fastest? And so I know that at Finance Committee, we've been told that we've been the most generous of the G7 countries and the fastest in terms of getting the dollars and the support to Canadians as fast as possible, both to individuals and to businesses. So anyways, again, lots of cooperation. It doesn't mean that there's not more to do and there's not more improvements. We have a long way to go. We're just at the beginning and we're all trying to find our way on how to find our way out of this pandemic and into a new normal that's positive moving forward. So I think with that, Robert, I probably do have to go, but it's been such an honor. Thank you for the great discussion. Honestly, the last hour went by in 5 minutes. I could have done another couple of hours, but it's just such an honor to be with General Fraser and with David Collenette today. And I really thank you for the opportunity. And I think these types of conversations are really important. Sometimes we become so insular, we forget what's happening in the world outside our country, and the importance of actually knowing what's happening in the world outside of our country to our own future happiness and our future economic prosperity. So thanks to all of you. Thank you for allowing me to join you today, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Julie.
you. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.
We'll continue with another question, but also I just wanted, before Milena, you read the next one off, I would like to address partially what the last question was asking about, international cooperation. Not many people have paid attention to what NATO has been doing, but there have been a tremendous amount of flights, mainly in Europe, but between NATO allies, exchanges of medical equipment, doctors actually, sometimes hospital beds, transferring some sick people to different hospitals, food, expertise. These have all been flying across Europe from NATO country to NATO country. Because it is such a large alliance, there are some countries who are doing really well at one thing and some that are not doing so well. So that's one of the other advantages of having this alliance, being able to exchange when one country is strong and another might not be so strong, to utilize that kind of flow between the two countries. Milena, do you want to read our next question?
Sure, yeah. So one of our viewers asks, what can Canada do to bring back critical manufacturing to North America?
I'll start with that because I sit on a couple of publicly traded boards. I mean, it's already happening that we are repatriating good jobs back to Canada, engineering positions and jobs, manufacturing jobs, because, you know, the security of doing it here in Canada, there is a growing demand, a need to do it. I think what we've learned is we were too exposed to the global economy where it was just in time delivery, and other nations, when things happen like a pandemic, nations take care of themselves first and their outside customers second. I think what we've learned is we got to do that, and it's good for Canada. It's good for the economy. And I think, again, going back, there are great studies out there. The Emerson report, the Jenkins report, if we reread those, I mean, there's opportunities there for national industrial strategies that we can actually reinforce what we have here and what we're capable of doing for the benefit of Canada, and by and large for that Canada-US relationship, which will reinforce the NATO relationship. I think there's great opportunities right now if we just get on with it and start doing something about it and not talk about it for 10 years.
I agree with General Fraser, and and it's not just state-driven or government-driven. I think what you're seeing right now is the private sector is coming to the conclusion that the arrangements they have, particularly with China or so much capacity being overseas, has to be rethought. Whether it comes home or whether it goes to allies in Europe or the United States or even other countries, say in Southeast Asia. I think that is actually happening. You get to a certain age, and so you're dependent on the drug system to keep you going. And what really appalled me is that to learn that 80% of the ingredients of just about our entire drug requirements are basically sourced in India and China. And so this is incredible that any pills any of us may take, therapeutic pills or whatever, for medications, that we are reliant so much on just two sources. And that has to change. I mean, the whole essence of a capitalist system, a free enterprise system, is that there are choices, that you can go to different options where you get a better price, a better quality of goods. And I think this rethinking is going on as a result of this pandemic, not just in government, but within the private sector.
I think we'll do maybe two more questions, Milena, and then we'll allow both of you to give a kind of a sum up comment.
Sure. So the next question is, due to the COVID-19 lockdowns, there have been arising anti-government rallies and protests. Can these anti-government mentalities impact governmental and international organizations such as NATO and create barriers for security in the long run?
Thoughtful expressions.
I think all governments have done as good of a job. The democratic governments have done about as good of a job as you can think of. How good, that's a very subjective discussion, whatnot. I think Canada, by and large, we were pretty quick to shut down, travel and whatnot to protect the citizens and whatnot. I think there's always going to be protests. I think that's part of the democratic process. There's going to be lots of studies about this, but this shouldn't be about blame. It should be about what did we learn? And as David Collenette said, what are the opportunities here to strengthen our economic system, to protect the well-beings of Canadians? I think the sharing and the collaborative nature in the science world, I think, is really important because that will generate a lot of goodness and to help, develop a vaccine faster, and not for just this COVID, but for other coronavirus types of events. And so I actually think that, there's a lot of benefit from this as opposed to, looking at the downside of it and whatnot. And there will be a minority of protesters out there, but by and large, everyone's trying to make this together and turn the economy back on without harming, our citizens.
Yes, I agree. I mean, look, protests are part of the democratic way. I mean, we need people to express their feeling. We're not a monolith as a society, so that doesn't bother me. I think the two things that really I've taken heart with the way this crisis has been dealt with, and General Fraser mentioned the agility of government, not just in this country but worldwide, to respond in an extraordinary fashion by fiscal stimulus and helping people who, 1 week they were employed, the next week they were out on the street. They didn't have a job. I think this is incredible the way governments have reacted. But the other thing, and in democratic societies that makes me really feel good, is the way everyone has basically volunteered with the lockdowns. Whether it's in Canada, in the United States, in Europe and Asia, Africa, India, around the world, people, sure, there's self-interest, no one wants to get sick, but there's an element of civic responsibility that I find heartening, that people have actually not been ordered by governments to do something. Yes, there've been lockdowns, but they've actually complied, and you haven't had to enforce it in any way.
That's a very good point.
Question?
Next question. One of our viewers writes, China's interpretation of the international order has been seen as a threat to Western values by some. In light of COVID-19, what do you believe are some steps that Canada should pursue to advance its own interests while continuing to build strong relationships of shared prosperity in context of divergent values?
It's actually something that we've been talking quite a bit about here at the NATO Association. NATO itself has its own problems with deciding whether it is first and foremost a security organization or one that's based on values first and foremost. And that, in this case, we are talking a little bit about the rules-based order. Is it just about the rules, or is it about the liberal values that help to originate those rules? It's an interesting question. Either of you?
Well, it is. It's not one. I mean, it is about rules and about the values. But the organization, the countries that come together within NATO, share similar values. I mean, some of the new members are learning what the values of those traditional members were, and have challenged us with our own values to. Have they kept up to the social, economic, and the norms and the evolution of our demographic populations and whatnot? But being more inclusive has actually made us stronger. And within that, then we create a set of rules and whatnot that should be perpetuating and whatnot, and able to resist crises like COVID. I think by and large, if you look at the financial aspect of the crisis, all those finance ministers of NATO are all talking to each other about what can we do together to help each other out. Starting at home, but how does this affect each other? And I think it's going back, Robert, to what you're saying. What is NATO? NATO started off as a defense alliance. It became a security alliance, but it also became a forum where countries can actually talk their challenges through. It went international. I think it's complementary to the UN, which is complementary to NORAD, and I think they all work together in various shapes and forms.
I do have some
NATO, we have nowhere to go and talk.
Sorry to interrupt. I do have some concern with some of the members of NATO. In the way the politics of the countries are going. I have no concern about the military cooperation, and General Fraser knows it better than I do, that one thing I was really impressed with when I was minister, that was a long time ago, before Partnership for Peace brought in the expansion. But I think it's the situation today is how the militaries all cooperate together. It's seamless, and they look out for each other, they have each other's back. But what I'm concerned about is with the rise of populism, and we have regimes in Turkey, in Hungary, even in Poland, where the shared values that have underpinned NATO are now straining situation. And so I think we've got to keep an eye on that, because whether it's Erdogan or other countries, you know, we have to make sure that that everyone basically stays on message and adheres to the principles that formulated NATO back in 1949.
I think I steered the original question away from its real point, and Elena, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the main thrust of the question was also about how China is now using our own rules against us, or is utilizing the rules aspect of the rules-based order for its own gain and to mess with us, essentially. Any comments?
Well, and I to that, I think, you know, the cooperation that we have with China from a scientific point of view, I go back to what is the intent? Is the intent to sort of shore up what happened, or is it actually to find, you know, or is it truly altruistic about finding a solution? And what are they going to do with the next thing? I still question China's intent, both as a trading partner, as a political, nation or whatnot. I mean, they do not abide by the same values and rules that we have in this country. So I'm always leery. Where are their hands in my pocket?
I agree with General Fraser. I think that you know, China has not played by the rules since it joined the WTO, and I'm not a trade expert, but you know, they have to be called into account, and you cannot in life ignore bad behavior, if you will. You know, I look at the situation of today and compare it to what happened in the 1930s, and there are some parallels. And we can look inward and we can try and ignore what's going on, but at a certain point, we're going to have to make a determination to get involved and to say to others what you're doing is wrong. It doesn't mean to say we can't be friends, we can't cooperate, but there has to be a general consensus about how we operate as societies, as good world citizens, no matter what country.
All right, well, with that, I would like to draw the event to a close with some brief lessons learned or just your final comments from this discussion. So why don't we start with Major General retired David Fraser.
Well, Robert, thank you, and thank you, Melania, for hosting this today. It was great to be with David and with Julie. I would say we're into a new era for Canada and Canada within NATO. We're not nowhere near what the new norm is going to be, but it is not business as usual. Our economies are going to change dramatically. And I think there's going to be a lot of challenges to existing organizations and whatnot. But I think as long as we have a dialogue, understand it's not business as normal. But what kept us together in the greatest probably period of peace, we shouldn't forget about that and keep that as a basis of trying to figure out what this new normal is going to be and try to maintain that peaceful coexistence with our other allies.
Perfect. And the Honorable David Collenette, your last thought there.
Well, thank you, Robert and Melania, too, and the NATO Association for putting us on, and David Fraser and Julie Dzerowicz. It was an honor to be with both of you on the panel, and I don't really want to repeat a lot of what was said. I sort of was leading into it in my last answer, but I do think that this is an unprecedented challenge. These are events that come around every century or so, and we have to draw lessons from the past. We have to agree there has to be a general framework for world order that everyone has to ascribe to. And when some go outside of the general framework and cause harm to others or the system, the economy, health or whatever, then they have to be brought to account. I just think that you cannot ignore bad behavior in the same way you can't ignore bad behavior in society, in your neighborhood, or within your families. You cannot in the global community. There has to be responsibility. There has to be consequences for actions that are really against the broad goals of society at large. And I think that what we've been discussing today with the pandemic is has really focused in on those questions, and it's really I think it's going to force all of us to analyze not only our personal lives, the way we interact with ourselves, our families, our communities, our countries, but it does, as we've been discussing, force every country to reflect on how they are going to continue as part of the global community.
Perfect. Thank you so much to both of you, and to Julie. It was wonderful to have you here for the discussion. I would like to thank sincerely Milena Glumak. Thanks so much, Milena, for helping to put this on. For any of you that are interested in becoming more involved with the NATO Association, we continue to put on events like this. We'll be doing one next week at 10 a.m. on Friday morning regarding cyber and the cyber situation in the COVID crisis. I would love it if you join our organization. We're here trying to make sure that Canadians understand the value of security, why NATO is important. It's a never-ending struggle. It's something that we just have to keep reminding ourselves about, the value of our security, unprecedented nature of the past 70 years of peace, prosperity, and security. And we have to dedicate ourselves to make sure that we are going to maintain that. So once again, thank you all for joining, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.